पंजाबी देखते हुए सारे दर्शकों ਨੂੰ ਮੇਰੇ ਵੱਲੋਂ ਪਿਆਰ ਭਰੀ ਸਤਿ ਸ੍ਰੀ ਅਕਾਲ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਸਵਾਗਤ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਅੱਜ ਦਾ ਮੁੱਦਾ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਮੈਂ ਤੁਹਾਡੀ ਹੋਸਟ ਆਸ਼ਮਿਤਾ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਇਸ ਸ਼ਾਮ ਦੇ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇੱਕ ਵਾਰੀ ਫਿਰ ਨਿੱਘਾ ਸਵਾਗਤ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਸਾਡੀ ਟੀਮ ਕੈਲੀਫੋਰਨੀਆ ਤੋਂ ਹੁਣ ਪਹੁੰਚ ਚੁੱਕੀ ਹੈ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇੱਕ ਬਹੁਤ ਹੀ ਇੰਟਰਸਟਿੰਗ ਇਤਿਹਾਸਿਕ ਪ੍ਰੋਜੈਕਟ ਬਾਰੇ ਇਨਫੋਰਮੇਸ਼ਨ ਮੈਂ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਅੱਜ ਸ਼ੇਅਰ ਕਰਨ ਜਾ ਰਹੀ ਹਾਂ ਅਕਸਰ ਅਸੀਂ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਕਿ ਪੰਜਾਬੀਆਂ ਦਾ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਦਾ ਇਤਿਹਾਸ ਕਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਬਚਾ ਸਕਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਕਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਉਸ ਇਤਿਹਾਸ ਬਾਰੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਹੋਰ ਜਾਣਕਾਰੀ ਪਾ ਸਕਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਸਾਡਾ ਇਤਿਹਾਸ ਸਾਡੀ ਕਮਿਊਨਿਟੀ ਦਾ ਇਤਿਹਾਸ ਨਾ ਕਿ ਸਿਰਫ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕਿੰਨੀ ਸਦੀਆਂ ਤੋਂ ਅੱਗੇ ਵਧਦਾ ਆ ਰਿਹਾ ਹੈ ਬਟ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਹਰਲੇ ਮੁਲਕਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਖਾਸ ਕਰਕੇ ਜਦੋਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਵੱਲ ਵੇਖਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਇੱਥੇ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਦਾ ਇਤਿਹਾਸ ਕਿੰਨੀ ਸਦੀਆਂ ਪਹਿਲੇ ਤੱਕ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਹੈ ਇਨਫੈਕਟ ਜਦੋਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਵੇਖਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਜੋ ਸਭ ਤੋਂ ਪਹਿਲੇ ਸਿੱਖ ਨਾਰਥ ਅਮਰੀਕਾ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਮਾਈਗ੍ਰੇਟ ਹੋਏ ਉਹ ਪਹਿਲੇ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਵਿੱਚ ਪਹੁੰਚੇ ਲੇਕਿਨ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੈਨਕੂਵਰ ਅਤੇ ਵੈਸਟ ਕੋਸਟ ਤੇ ਅਕਸਰ ਸਾਡਾ ਫੋਕਸ ਰਹਿੰਦਾ ਹੈ ਬਿਕਾਜ਼ ਉੱਥੇ ਸਾਡੇ ਸਿੱਖ ਪਹਿਲੇ ਆ ਕੇ ਵਸੇ ਸੀ ਅਗਰ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਵੈਸਟ ਕੋਸਟ ਤੋਂ ਥੋੜਾ ਅੱਗੇ ਈਸਟ ਆਉਂਦੇ ਹੋ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਵੇਖ ਸਕਦੇ ਹੋ ਕਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਦਾ ਜੋ ਇੱਥੇ ਇੱਕ ਰੈਕਡ ਹੈਗਾ ਉਹ ਨਾ ਕਿ ਸਿਰਫ ਵੈਨਕੂਵਰ ਜਾਂ ਬਿਲਕੁਲ ਵੈਸਟ ਏਰੀਆ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਪਾਇਆ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਹੈ ਬਟ ਜਿੱਥੋਂ ਮੈਂ ਅੱਜ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਇਹ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਪੇਸ਼ ਕਰ ਰਹੀ ਹਾਂ ਕੈਲਗਰੀ ਵਿਖੇ ਐਲਬਰਟਾ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੀ ਸਿੱਖ ਕਿੰਨੇ ਪੁਰਾਣੇ ਤੋਂ ਆਏ ਹੋਏ ਹੈ ਇਨਫੈਕਟ ਰੈਕਡਸ ਦੱਸਦੇ ਆ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਕਿ 1903 ਤੱਕ ਇੱਥੇ ਸਿੱਖ ਪਹੁੰਚ ਗਏ ਸੀ ਇਨਫੈਕਟ ਉਸ ਟਾਈਮ ਤਾਂ ਐਲਬਰਟਾ ਜਿੱਥੇ ਮੈਂ ਅੱਜ ਹਾਂ ਐਲਬਰਟਾ ਅਫੀਸ਼ੀਅਲੀ ਐਗਜ਼ਿਸਟ ਵੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਰਦਾ ਸੀ ਤਦ ਦੇ ਰੈਕਡਸ ਹੈਗੇ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਦੇ ਇਸ ਇਲਾਕੇ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਐਂਡ ਇਹ ਜਾਣਕਾਰੀ ਕਿੰਨੇ ਇਕੱਠੀ ਕੀਤੀ ਇਹ ਜਾਣਕਾਰੀ ਕਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਸਾਡੇ ਕੋਲ ਅੱਗੇ ਅੱਜ ਆਈ ਹੈ ਸਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਉਹ ਇਹੀ ਇੰਡੀਵਿਜੂਅਲ ਜੁੜੇ ਹਨ ਜੋ ਕਿ ਇਸ ਜਾਣਕਾਰੀ ਨੂੰ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਇੱਕ ਪ੍ਰੋਪਰ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕਹਿ ਲਓ ਰਿਸਰਚ ਪ੍ਰੋਜੈਕਟ ਅੱਗੇ ਵਧਾ ਰਹੇ ਹਨ ਕਿੰਨੇ ਸਾਲਾਂ ਤੋਂ ਇਸ ਰਿਸਰਚ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਲੱਗੇ ਹੋਏ ਪ੍ਰੋਫੈਸਰ ਅੱਜ ਸਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਜੁੜੇ ਹਨ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਬਹੁਤ ਖੁਸ਼ੀ ਹੋ ਰਹੀ ਹੈ ਮਾਊਂਟ ਰਾਇਲ ਯੂਨੀਵਰਸਿਟੀ ਤੋਂ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਇਹ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਪੇਸ਼ ਕਰਦੇ ਹੋਏ ਹੁਣ ਰਲ ਕੇ ਮੇਰੇ ਨਾਲ ਸਵਾਗਤ ਕਰੋ ਅੱਜ ਸ਼ਾਮ ਦੇ ਸਾਡੇ ਗੈਸਟ ਡਾਕਟਰ ਮਾਈਕਲ ਹੌਲੀ ਸਭ ਤੋਂ ਪਹਿਲੇ ਡਾਕਟਰ ਹੌਲੀ ਵੈਲਕਮ ਟੂ ਦ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਸਤਿ ਸ੍ਰੀ ਅਕਾਲ
ਸਤਿ ਸ੍ਰੀ ਅਕਾਲ ਪਲੀਜ਼ਡ ਟੂ ਬੀ ਹੇਅਰ ਥੈਂਕਸ ਫॉर ਹੈਵਿੰਗ ਮੀ
so good to have you thank you for hosting us in this wonderful university. You have a beautiful office crammed with books and artifacts and records. For the viewers' benefit, I want to let everyone know, Dr. Hawley, you're not just an associate professor of religious studies here at Mount Royal, you're adjunct professor of classics and religion at University of Calgary, and most notably, you're the founding chair of Sikh Studies Unit at the American Academy of Religion. Yes. Dr. Hawley, you have a academic career steeped in Asian studies and Sikh history. I have to ask at the onset, what compelled you to specifically take up this research project, the Sikh Alberta History Project? Please tell us a little bit about its inception.
I backed my way into it, to be perfectly honest. I became very, very interested in Sikhs and Sikh history just after I graduated with my degree. I graduated with a degree in actually modern Hindu history, Hindu colonial history. And shortly after I graduated, I was asked if I would teach a course on the Sikhs. You have to remember that there were no courses on the Sikhs, no courses on Sikhi, no courses on Sikhism. Certainly at the University of Calgary, very few in Canada at all. So I had no background. I had no background in Sikh tradition. So when I was asked if I'd teach a course, I said yes. And I spent about a year, 8 months reading everything I could find. Reading as many great scholars I could find, Sikh scholars, non-Sikh scholars, looking at other people's course outlines, and I managed to cobble together a course, which I don't think is all that great right now in hindsight, but I fell in love with the tradition. Wow. I fell in love with the history. I fell in love with the personalities. I fell in love with the teachings, the architecture, the kirtan, everything, and I changed directions. I turned my attention to Sikhs and Sikh history, but because I came late to the game, I didn't have the language skills. and I didn't have the language skills to read, 17th century Gurmukhi. I just didn't, and there's lots of people out there who will do a way better job than I could ever do. So I started to look to the diaspora, to Canada, to the United States, and in particular to Canada, about Sikhs here in this country. After all, Sikhs are, the largest concentration of Sikhs outside of India are here in Canada, and I found out very, very quickly that much of what was written about Sikhs in BC, in Vancouver, Lower Mainland, as you said, and I thought, well, what about Sikhs here? Mm-hmm. And I started to do some reading around and started looking for histories of Sikhs here, and there was very, very little written. Mm-hmm. Surprisingly little written. Mm-hmm. There was a little, I think about an 85-page little booklet that came out in 1985 with some interviews with some early Sikh families. Mm-hmm. There were a couple of essays by other academics, but they dealt with the Sikh tradition and the Gurdwaras in the 1970s, 1980s, mm-hmm. But really nothing about the early history. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was a little bit strange, right? Mm-hmm. Because if you read what was written, you'd walk away with the impression that there were only 2 Sikh families here before 1950. And that just didn't seem right to me. It didn't seem right. Right. And so I started digging around a little bit in the archives and looking at newspapers and trying to find migration and immigration papers. And very, very quickly, probably within about 6 months, I had probably about 200 or 300 documents. Wow. Ranging from newspaper articles to official government censuses to these sorts of things that talked about Sikhs being here in this province. Wow. Which meant there's a whole unwritten, buried, erased history here mm-hmm. that has yet to be told. And that's what got my interest in it. Dr. Hawley, when we were talking prior to recording this episode, you said something really interesting. I think someone said to you that, pre-1950 Sikh history in Alberta will take you 6 months. 6 months. A year. Yeah. How many years have you been at it? You're still researching from 1900 to 1950 Sikh history in Alberta. Mm-hmm. How many years have you been at this? I think we've been at it for probably about 6 or 7 years now. Wow. So it's not a quick thing. History and piecing together unwritten history takes a lot of time, mm-hmm. In part because you don't know what you're looking for. Mm-hmm. You don't know what pieces of the puzzle are going to be important. You don't know what the picture's going to be like. Right. So anything you find might be really important mm-hmm. or not important at all. Mm-hmm. So it's a lot of digging, it's a lot of keeping things, setting it aside, and putting things together. It's certainly a slow initiative, but despite that, it's certainly worth the time and effort. Give us the unique Alberta angle, right? Because once again, Alberta, this Calgary area is a little bit east of, the West Coast, which is so popular. Yeah. So well known around the world. Sikhs in Vancouver, Sikhs in Surrey. You don't have to say much more. But with Alberta, you've come across its own unique perspective. Tell us about that. Yeah, it's, as you said, sort of Alberta is just on the other side of the mountains from British Columbia. And the Sikh history here is very, very different because the Alberta context is different. Simply in terms of the number of Sikhs who came, are much, much smaller than those Sikhs who came to Victoria and mm-hmm. to Abbotsford and whatnot. There you're talking thousands. Mm-hmm. Here we're talking dozens of Sikhs. So the numbers are very, very small. The Alberta context as well is different because some of the laws were different in Alberta than they were in British Columbia. So, for example, Sikhs were permitted to vote in Alberta beginning, I think, in the mid or late 1930s, mm-hmm. where it wasn't until, I believe, 1947, 1948 when Sikhs were permitted to vote in British Columbia. Mm-hmm. Sikhs were permitted to own property here in Alberta, where the same wasn't always true in the British Columbia context.
First of all, as a member of the community, I have to say thank you for so diligently tracing this lineage that oftentimes we ourselves are so ignorant about. And it seems that a lot of your work has been reaching out to people or having people reach out to you and saying, hey, we have pictures, or hey, we have names, and you put the pictures or the names together from your end. It really is piecing together a puzzle, and it's really a beautiful picture that's emerging. We mentioned earlier to our folks that as far as the records you've come across so far, and we know you've been at this since roughly 2017, and you're still digging in the period from 1900 to 1950 Sikh history in Alberta. The earliest records that you've come across so far date back to 1903. Tell us about this.
Yeah, there's the earliest photographic evidence that we have dates from 1903. There's three photographs of Sikhs who arrived in the Crow's Nest Pass, which is way down in southern Alberta, really close to, the BC border and the United States border. It's actually one of the first places that Sikhs started to come into Alberta and make their way in there. We have three photographs of Sikhs. We don't know their names. We don't know where they came from. We don't really know what they did. We don't know how long they were here, but they were here in 1903. And what's interesting about 1903 is Alberta didn't become a province until 1905. Wow. Which means Sikhs have been in Alberta since before Alberta was Alberta.
I have to reiterate this once again. ਸਾਡੇ ਦਰਸ਼ਕਾਂ ਲਈ Alberta province ਬਣਿਆ 1905 1905 ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ, ਐਂਡ ਇੱਥੇ ਆਏ ਹੋਏ ਸਿੱਖ ਰੈਕਰਡਸ ਦੱਸਦੇ 1903 ਤੋਂ ਪਹੁੰਚੇ ਹੋਏ ਹੈ ਸਿੱਖ ਐਲਬਰਟਾ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇਸ ਪ੍ਰੋਵਿੰਸ ਦੀ ਆਫੀਸ਼ੀਅਲ ਐਗਜ਼ਿਸਟੈਂਸ ਤੋਂ ਵੀ ਪਹਿਲੇ ਇੱਥੇ ਆਏ ਹੋਏ ਹੈ.
And I think that's really significant, because what that means is we have to rethink the way that we talk about Sikhs in the province. We can no longer talk about Sikhs as migrants, because it's not as if Alberta existed and Sikhs came.
Right. They're settlers.
They are settlers. They are builders. They are founders. They were here with so many other groups before the province was even conceived of.
Wow.
So it turns our narrative about Sikhs and migration on its head.
My goodness.
And that's another unique thing about the Alberta case, other than that's different from the British Columbia case.
It's so interesting. You use this word migrant versus settler, founder, builder, right? Sikhs take pride in the rich lineage they have outside of Punjab, but oftentimes I think we relegate ourselves to migrants before anyone else has a chance to, that we migrated over. And sure, they did migrate over, but they helped build this place.
Yeah, absolutely.
There are some really cool stories you have, specifically the first person of Sikh heritage. Can you tell us about this individual?
Yeah, and I do have to give credit to my lovely colleague Pradeep Singh Nagra at the Sikh Heritage Museum in Malton, Ontario, because he pointed this one out to me. That the very first person of Sikh heritage to come to Alberta didn't come from the West Coast.
Okay.
Because we always think Sikhs migrated West Coast and then came eastwards. The first person of Sikh heritage actually came from Halifax on the East Coast.
Wow.
And this person's name was Victor J. Dulip Singh, who was the son of Maharaja Dulip Singh and the grandson of course, Maharaja Ranjit Singh. So there's royal connections here.
Goodness.
He came in actually around about this time of year, 135 years ago, 1888, late November. And he came on the newly built CPR railway. He made his way from Halifax all the way to Victoria. He spent a couple days in Victoria and then came all the way back. So he is the first person of Sikh heritage. And we've got that royal connection.
And how did you come across that piece of information? I know you told me your good friend and aide in this project pointed this out to you. But what was the the record that was discovered
Right.
that kind of, helped you determine that 1888, this individual that has this royal lineage, a descendant of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, was actually one of the first people of Sikh heritage in Canada.
Yeah, we as far as my project's concerned, we did it through reading newspapers and newspaper reports of his journey across Canada. Unfortunately, he wasn't reported in Alberta papers.
Right.
He was reported in Winnipeg papers and in Victoria papers. But there is also another scholar by the name of David Gray who is working on Victor J. Dulip Singh residence in Halifax. And I believe he has actually found the residence and perhaps some of his possessions as well. So, I mean, we've got people working all over the country on these sorts of things.
I see that it's really nice to have that royal connection, and because everyone takes so much pride in Maharaja Ranjit Singh, to see his lineage travel to this side of the world at such an, it's such a period in history, right? Pre-colonialism, pre-British Raj, all these things. British Raj, the modern understanding of it, right? In the 1900s at least, right? But there was a large diversity in the migration that took place. On one hand, you have this descendant of royalty, but you have a whole plethora of other types of folks that also made their way here. Can you share some information about this diversity that existed and the kind of people that were coming over?
Yeah, and this is one of the things that I actually found really exciting about the stuff that I found, is that sort of the standard story is that Sikhs came to Vancouver Island, and they worked maybe on railways, but largely in lumber mills. And maybe some of them farmed.
Okay.
In Alberta, we have Sikhs coming from certainly Punjab, but from other places in the world as well, as they did in Vancouver and British Columbia. But a lot of Sikhs who came into Alberta actually probably landed in the United States first, and then came up from California, came up across the border near Idaho or Washington State, and into the Crow's Nest Pass area. And Sikhs, when they got here, certainly some worked on the railways, some worked in the lumber mills, some farmed, but the diversity of occupations absolutely struck me. I have found records of a Sikh as a miner, which was very interesting. Sikhs as entrepreneurs, store owners.
Restaurant owners, I think you said.
Restaurant owners.
Even back then, the Sikh population knew, if you want some, dal, roti, paranthe, you got to open your own restaurant.
Oh, never mind that. He was selling tamales.
Oh my gosh.
He was selling tamales in Lethbridge.
Wow.
About 1920.
My goodness.
I don't know why, and I don't know what a Punjabi tamale would taste like, but
probably delicious.
There were people who worked in hotels. I found records of one person who worked for Imperial Oil, a pottery factory. So there's this whole diverse range, which really gives a lot more texture and color to Sikh history.
Mount Royal University ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਿੱਥੇ ਇੱਕ ਇਹੋ ਜਿਹਾ ਪ੍ਰੋਜੈਕਟ ਜਾਰੀ ਹੈ ਜਿਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਦਾ ਇਤਿਹਾਸ, ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਦੀ ਲਿਨੀਏਜ ਜੋ ਵਿਰਾਸਤ ਐਲਬਰਟਾ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇਸ ਪ੍ਰੋਵਿੰਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕਿੰਨੇ ਸਦੀਆਂ ਤੋਂ ਵਸਦੀ ਆ ਰਹੀ ਹੈ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਰਿਸਰਚ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਕੈਟਲੌਗ ਕਰ ਰਹੀ ਹੈ ਇਹ ਪ੍ਰੋਜੈਕਟ ਆਨਗੋਇੰਗ ਹੈ ਜੋ ਮੇਨ ਰਿਸਰਚਰ ਪ੍ਰਿੰਸੀਪਲ ਰਿਸਰਚਰ ਇਸ ਪ੍ਰੋਜੈਕਟ ਦੇ ਸੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਇਹ ਦੱਸਿਆ ਗਿਆ ਸੀ ਕਿ 1900 ਤੋਂ ਲੈ ਕੇ 1950 ਤੱਕ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਮਸੀ ਕੁਝ ਮਹੀਨਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਕੰਮ ਨਿਬੜ ਜਾਣਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਦਾ ਇੰਨਾ ਕੋਈ ਕੁਝ ਜਾਣਕਾਰੀ ਹਿਸਟਰੀ ਹੈਗੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਐਲਬਰਟਾ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਸ ਦੌਰਾਨ Dr. Michael Hawley has been covering the period of 1900 to 1950 of Sikhs in Alberta for the last 6+ years.
6+ years.
It certainly was more than a few months worth of records. Dr. Hawley, this project and the various unique attributes, the royal connections that the Sikh history in Alberta has, we've kind of gone through some of those, but I'd love to hear about these notable individuals. No doubt there's viewers that are watching today, whether they're in the US, Canada, or anywhere else in the world, that may have connections to these families, these surnames, that would be especially intrigued to hear about some of these notable individuals. Can you please tell us about what your research has uncovered?
Sure, and I'll start with perhaps the most well-known Calgarian, a fellow by the name of Harnam Singh Hari, came from the village of Ranake, came to Canada in about 1910 and arrived in Calgary probably shortly thereafter. His story is sort of the very typical solo travel migrant story, that he arrived in Calgary with very little money in his pocket. He jumped on a train to try to get to Calgary. He was kicked off the train. He walked the last 50 miles into town. Wow. He found jobs hauling bags of cement. When he actually got that job, the employees who were working there, each of them were carrying 100-pound bag of cement each. Harnam Singh Hari picked up one in each hand, and he could load it twice as fast as anyone else. So he got the job. He eventually befriended people in the city. He started farming. He started raising hogs. He started to make some good money. And he started to purchase land. And within a very relatively short period of time, he owned about 5,000 acres of land.
Oh my goodness.
In Calgary. It was lots and lots of land in Calgary and also just south of the city now. Some of that land is still in family hands.
Wow. And what time period would this be?
He would have started purchasing that land in probably the 1920s.
My goodness.
Into the 1930s. He eventually brought other members of his family here. There's, I think, the 6th generation of the Hari family are living in Calgary.
6ਵੀਂ ਪੀੜ੍ਹੀ ਹਰੀ ਫੈਮਿਲੀ ਦੀ ਕੈਲਗਰੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਰਹਿ ਰਹੀ ਹੈ 1920 ਤੋਂ ਲੈ ਕੇ 1930 ਤੱਕ ਹਰੀ ਸਿੰਘ ਇਸ ਪਰਿਵਾਰ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ 5000 ਏਕੜ ਲੈਂਡ ਖਰੀਦਿਆ ਗਿਆ ਸੀ ਇੱਥੇ ਕੈਲਗਰੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ I mean this is an extremely notable feat, especially considering the time period when it was done. Wow.
But 6 generations of that family. I'm 2nd generation Calgary. Who's the migrant?
Wow.
Right? Who's the migrant? We're dealing with now the 6th generation of that family living in Calgary. He did very, very well for himself. He sold his land to developers in about 1956 and made about $240,000 in 1956. So he did quite well for himself and went back and plowed a lot of that money back into his village in Ranake.
Wow. Yeah. That is that's the textbook story that you hear from a Sikh migrant, right? They leave their home, they leave their beloved land to go find opportunity. And ideally they find opportunity, they find the wealth, and they bring it back home. But no doubt leaving a undeniable imprint on their new home, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, this is one individual. I know there's so many other. I'd love to hear about some of these other folks as well.
And just to sort of as a footnote to Harnam Singh Hari, there's actually a park in Calgary named after him where his original farm was. So, I mean, there's that public recognition, which I think is just so wonderful and so needed as well. We have other early migrants, a fellow by the name of Bishan Singh, who worked in a lumber mill in the 1920s down in the Crow's Nest Pass. For him, we actually do have a photograph of him. And he's a clean-shaven Sikh. He is pictured sitting on top of a pile of lumber ready to be taken to market. But what's noticeable is he is dressed in a white dress shirt, a tie, black pants, and shined shoes.
Oh my goodness.
He's a person of consequence at the mill. He's
someone important.
Not a laborer. He's not wearing the overalls. He's not covered in sawdust.
Right.
He is not
tie and shined shoes.
Yeah,
wow.
And so he's probably making some good money. He probably had a good deal of influence at the mill, and there's lots of newspaper stories about him. He was quite a character.
So what kind of stories are these, and what are some of the timestamps around these stories around Bishan Singh?
Oh, there's so we're talking probably early 1920s to the 1930s. There's stories of him participating in community events, community raffles.
Wow.
He's referred to Bish by many in the community, so he was a known quantity. He also fell prey to an extortion scam where people tried to extort money from him.
So he's clearly known as a wealthier individual,
known as wealthy,
someone to target even by, the nefarious sort.
Exactly.
Wow.
So he's a person of consequence, which again turns this whole story of sort of the uneducated laborers, right, or people without consequence. No. Wow. Here we have someone clearly who's a person of influence and consequence and wealthy.
My goodness.
Working at the same time.
One name stands out on this list, the Puller last name. This is a name that is obviously, a very notable name even today.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear about that for a specific individual.
We know lots about Sohan Singh Puller. But I will try to keep it brief, but I do get excited about this, so I try to keep it brief. He came to Canada probably in about 1906, so he came very, very early. We're not sure what he did for about 10 years, but he turns up in Alberta around about 1918. He is farming near Lethbridge, which is down in the southern part of the province. He's the one with the hot tamale stand, who's also a restaurateur, and he does a number of other projects. But what is interesting is he actually marries into the African American, the Black community here. And he and his wife, whose name is Ephigenia Jones, she was from Mississippi. They have 7 children.
Wow.
They eventually move up into the Edmonton area, so north of here. And their youngest daughter, who they named Judy Singh, became actually somewhat of a jazz legend.
Wow.
And has albums out, and she became sort of quite the known face of jazz in Western Canada.
And what a unique lineage. We think, and I hate to oversimplify this, that the community today has more interfaith marriages and relations, because it's modern times. But really, this story, Sohan Singh Puller, reminds us that these kind of relationships, these kind of families that, were these commingled families existed as early as the early 1900s, right here in Alberta.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of that is because of the small numbers of Sikhs and Punjabis compared to, say, British Columbia.
Right.
But there's, I think out of the 6 marriages that I know of prior to 1950 for Punjabi men, 4 of them were into the African American community. Wow. One was to a white Irish Presbyterian woman, and another was the person went back to Punjab and married a Punjabi and then brought family back. Yeah.
Sikh इतिहास किन्ना सुनहरा है सानू सारिਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਪਤਾ ਹੈ ਬਟ ਕਦੇ-ਕਵਾਰ ਇਹਦੀ ਡਿਟੇਲਡ ਜਾਣਕਾਰੀ ਪਾਣ ਲਈ ਇੱਕ ਅਫੀਸ਼ੀਅਲ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕਹ ਲਓ ਰਿਸਰਚ ਪ੍ਰੋਜੈਕਟ ਦੇ ਤੌਰ ਤੇ ਇਹੋ ਜੀ ਜਾਣਕਾਰੀ ਨੂੰ ਕਲੈਕਟ ਕਰਨਾ ਪੈਂਦਾ ਹੈ। ਇਹੀ ਪ੍ਰੋਜੈਕਟ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕਹਿ ਲਓ ਲੀਡ ਕੀਤਾ ਜਾ ਰਿਹਾ ਹੈ ਡਾਕਟਰ ਮਾਈਕਲ ਹੌਲੀ ਵੱਲੋਂ the Alberta Sikh History Project. Dr. Hawley, there's so much that you've uncovered. We could hardly only scratch the surface in today's program, so no doubt we would love to have you join us again. But I would be remiss if in this conversation today we didn't talk about the activism. We didn't talk about some of the notable women that come up in your research, because, it's almost ignorant of us to say that this rich history that spans decades, generations, was only an effort led by the men or the male members of these Sikh families, right? So let's start with the women.
Okay.
Who are the notable women that you've come across?
I'm so glad you asked that, because one of the things I really wanted to do was include women and women's participation and women's contributions, because women were here. They were doing things too. It just wasn't the Singhs. The Kaurs were there too. The first woman recorded in Alberta is a woman by the name of Dang Kaur. She came in 1921. Wow. From Jandiala.
Wow.
She came to join her husband, a fellow by the name of Birama Singh, who had been here earlier. She came. The two farmed together, and she was very much an entrepreneur. She, from her own farm, milked her own cows, made her own butter, collected her own eggs, but she went and sold them on her own. And by the way, she didn't turn over her money to her husband. She kept it, and she built her own house in Calgary with the money that she earned.
Wow.
She was one of the people who were really instrumental in the 1960s in helping later migrants come and settle, find places to live, find jobs. So she was absolutely instrumental in building the community here.
And, you know, this is one of those things where I just have to once again give context to our viewers. 1920 ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਧਨ ਕੌਰ ਇੱਥੇ ਆ ਕੇ ਨਾ ਕਿ ਸਿਰਫ ਖੇਤੀਬਾੜੀ but entrepreneurship ਵੱਲ ਇੱਕ expertise display ਕਰ ਰਹੀ ਸੀ 1920 ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ. What other women did you come across?
Yeah, and if I could just say something about that entrepreneurship, it's very likely that Dang Kaur was illiterate.
Wow.
Because I have her immigration form and she has signed it with an X. And I've seen immigration forms that are signed in the English script, but also in Punjabi, but she signed with an X. And yet, remarkably successful.
My goodness.
And a very, had a good business acumen, let's put it that way.
Not just successful, but, you know, the work that you allude to in the 60s that you did, impactful for future generations.
Absolutely. And there's still people here, the older members of the community, who speak very, very highly and very, very fondly of her.
My goodness.
There is another woman who I must mention is a woman by the name of Man Kaur. And Man Kaur appears in only one record, and that's the 1926 census. And she is recorded as living in the Crow's Nest Pass at a lumber mill with her husband and 6 other Singhs.
Oh my goodness.
Could you imagine the stories that she had to tell?
Wow.
I cannot imagine, and that's the first time I have ever seen a Kaur listed as residing at the lumber mill.
With 6 other Singhs.
Yeah, with 6 other Singhs,
including her husband. Right.
Yeah, so it's just like remarkable. And unfortunately, she disappears off the records after that. We just have this one little glimpse of her.
But, you know, I have to say, just to kind of tie it into how important the actions that we take today are to preserve our history for future generations. We just had in the United States a census take place in 2020, and we pushed so hard for our community to participate. Oftentimes people feel, oh, what's the point? You know, here I am, I'm just one individual in a sea of people. Obviously the demographics today are very different, right? When you look at how the census is collecting the data and the people that are taking part in it. But that one census record shows that, yes, once again, that Sikhs were in Alberta, they were residing, they were working, they were coexisting. They were business owners, entrepreneurs. I mean, this is incredible.
But for anyone who thinks that they're only one person and their story doesn't matter, I say no. Every story matters. And it's one thing to be able to go through the records, and that's one thing. I can do that. But where the real history is, it's in boxes, in people's basements, in their garages. It's stories from the BBs tell about, you know, not being able to find the right dal, not the right atta. How do you cook with all this weird stuff?
Right.
What was it like raising children?
Right.
I've spoken with Kaurs who had neighbors come over to teach them how to make apple pie for, you know,
goodness.
These are the stories that I think are really important. And those are the stories that really make up our history.
Dr. Hawley, no history is ever remembered without an air of activism, without folks that put their neck on the line to make a better world for the next generation. Right. Your research also has a activist air to it, because there is no escaping it when you look at the Sikhs, at least. Right. Can you tell us about how activism comes up in some of the work that you've done?
Absolutely. And I was actually really surprised by this as well, that we have records in Alberta of Sikhs making very, very public cases for equal treatment, for equal rights, for opening up immigration legislation that was really, really restrictive. I have the record of a Dr. Sundar Singh, who came from Vancouver. This would be 1912. Wow. So this is before the Komagata Maru. Right. This is before the Komagata Maru, addressing the Chamber of, I think it's the Chamber of Commerce here in Calgary, talking about the inequities.
My goodness.
We have folks such as folks who attended the University of Alberta in the 1930s. There's a fellow by the name of Sadhu Singh Dhami who became a very well-known novelist. Right. And his thinly veiled autobiography is called Maluka, but was also the subject of a Canadian film that just came out last year.
Wow.
We have someone like Hazara Zingarta, who was who graduated from the University of Alberta in 1938. With a Master of Science in Agriculture, which was actually one of the highest degrees at the university at the time. And he certainly took that degree. He went back to Punjab and he started to apply that technology in Punjab, but also was a staunch advocate for women's education and women to get involved in agriculture that way. Wow. And there's lots of other examples too.
Dr. Hawley, I mean, this is beyond fascinating. Not just the diversity in the types of people that came, which once again ranges from royals like descendants of Maharaja Ranjit Singh all the way to illiterate entrepreneurs working the farm lucratively. You know, but amongst all this, you had said this to me earlier as well, and I want you to reiterate this point. This project is as much your research as it is the community sharing experiences that they've been handed down from their elders. Their family history is being documented. Do you have a message for viewers that, you know, for them to take part, to get involved, or maybe share or add some of their family history if it fits into this particular frame? We've been showing your website for the Alberta Sikh History Project on air. Folks have been watching it. I do urge everyone, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਜ਼ਰੂਰ ਇਸ ਵੈਬਸਾਈਟ ਤੇ ਜਾ ਕੇ ਵੇਖੋ ਕੀ ਕੁਝ ਇਕੱਠਾ ਕੀਤਾ ਗਿਆ ਹੈ, alberta-sikhhistory.ca. What call to action, what message do you have for viewers?
If people are able to help us, and by us, I mean myself, I mean the community, I mean Albertans, tell this story, piece together this story, please get in touch. No matter how small or how insignificant you think the contribution is, a picture, a document, go through your boxes.
Yes.
Because this really needs to be a community-led project. Reach out, get in touch. Social media has been great. Facebook, what I've got on the web, and people very often reach out saying, hey, wait a minute, I think I might know, or my Nanaji may have worked with somebody who knew somebody.
Via.
Exactly. So this is the way this project is getting done.
My goodness.
So I'm actually not running it. The community's running it now. And together we'll be able to sort of tell this story.
Once again, Dr. Michael Hawley, Principal Researcher on the Alberta Sikh History Project. Such a pleasure, so insightful to hear about your work, which is enduring and certainly ongoing. Thank you so much for all of your efforts, and we wish you the best of luck with this project. Thank you again for taking the time to be with us today. It was wonderful talking with you.
Thank you very much.
ਸਤਿ ਸ਼੍ਰੀ ਅਕਾਲ ਦਰਸ਼ਕੋ ਅਗਰ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਸਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਜਾਂ ਡਾਕਟਰ ਮਾਈਕਲ ਹੌਲੀ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਸੰਪਰਕ ਕਰਨਾ ਚਾਹੁੰਦੇ ਹੋ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਜ਼ਰੂਰ ਸਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਕਨੈਕਟ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ ਹੋ info@jusbroadcasting.com info@jusbroadcasting.com aashmeeta@jusbroadcasting.com ਹੁਣ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਵੀ ਦਿਓ ਇਜਾਜ਼ਤ ਸਤਿ ਸ਼੍ਰੀ ਅਕਾਲ